By the time Emmeline Fairfax realized her freedom had been quietly traded away, the ink on the bargain was already dry. England, 1824. The study of Fairmont House carried the scent of old leather and desperation. Emmeline Fairmont stood before the mahogany desk where her uncle Theodore sat, his face flushed with wine and something darker, a calculated cruelty that made her stomach turn. The late afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across stacks of unpaid bills that littered every surface. "You cannot be serious," Emmeline said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. At 26, she had learned to mask fear beneath composure, a skill honed during the long months of watching her father waste away while the family fortune crumbled around them. Theodore leaned back in the worn chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "I am entirely serious, niece. The contract is signed. You will marry Lord Victor Marlowe 3 weeks hence, and in doing so, you will settle the debts your father so carelessly accumulated." "My father's illness was not careless," Emmeline replied, her green eyes flashing. "He spent every penny trying to save himself so he might continue caring for this family. And yet, here we are," Theodore said, gesturing broadly at the crumbling estate around them. "Penniless, disgraced, at the mercy of creditors who grow less patient by the day." He withdrew a document from his desk drawer, the parchment crisp and official. "Lord Marlowe has generously agreed to assume all debts in exchange for your hand in marriage. The ceremony will take place at his private chapel. All arrangements have been made." Emmeline felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "You had no right to negotiate such an arrangement without consulting me. As your legal guardian following your father's death 6 months past, I have every right," Theodore countered. His eyes would not meet hers. "You are unmarried, without prospects, and no longer young. This offer is more generous than you deserve." The words struck like physical blows, each one landing precisely where Theodore intended. Emmeline had spent her youth caring for her ailing father, sacrificing seasons in London, declining invitations to balls and gatherings, ensuring he had comfort in his final years. She had accepted her fate as a spinster with something approaching peace, finding purpose in duty rather than romance. But this was something else entirely. "I would prefer to work," Emmeline said quietly. "To become a governess or companion. Surely that is preferable to marrying a stranger." You would prefer to disgrace this family further." Theodore stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "To see the Fairmont name dragged through every gambling hall and debtor's prison in England. No, you will marry Lord Marlowe. You will do so with grace and gratitude, and you will spare me your protests." Emmeline studied her uncle's face, searching for any trace of the man who had once bounced her on his knee as a child, who had told stories of nights and quests during long summer afternoons. That man was gone, replaced by this creature who spoke of her as though she were livestock to be sold at market. "What manner of man is Lord Marlowe?" she asked, grasping at any information that might prepare her for what lay ahead. Theodore waved a dismissive hand. "Wealthy, connected. He moves in circles far above our current standing. You should be grateful for his interest. That tells me nothing of his character. His character is that he is willing to save this family from ruin," Theodore snapped. "That is all you need to know." But Emmeline could read the evasion in her uncle's eyes, the way his gaze slid away from hers. Whatever Theodore knew of Lord Marlowe, he had no intention of sharing it. The realization settled cold in her chest. "May I at least meet him before the wedding?" she asked. "He will call upon you next week for dinner. Until then, I suggest you prepare yourself for your new station." Theodore returned to his seat, effectively dismissing her. "And Emmeline, do not entertain thoughts of refusing. The contract is binding. If you flee or refuse to honor it, I will have no choice but to turn you out without a penny. You will be homeless, friendless, and utterly alone." Emmeline turned and left the study before her uncle could see the tears threatening to spill. She moved through the familiar corridors of Fairmont House, each room holding memories of a happier time when her mother had filled these halls with laughter, when her father had been healthy and strong. All of it was gone now, stripped away by illness and misfortune. leaving her at the mercy of a man who saw her only as a means to escape his own failures. Her bedchamber felt like a sanctuary, though a temporary one. Emmeline closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to breathe. The room was simply furnished, most of the valuable pieces having been sold months ago. What remained were books, her mother's writing desk, and a small painted miniature of her parents on their wedding day. She crossed to the desk and withdrew fresh parchment, her hands shaking as she reached for her pen. There was only one person who might help her now. The letter to Lady Constance Wellesley was brief and desperate. Emmeline and Constance had been friends since childhood, their families neighbouring before Constance's marriage to a wealthy merchant. Though Constance's husband had proven difficult and controlling, she retained some independence, and more importantly, she possessed resources that Emmeline lacked. As Emmeline sealed the letter, a memory surfaced unbidden. She was 16 again, attending a summer gathering at the neighbouring estate of Northcliffe. The day had been warm and bright, perfect for the picnic organised by her mother. Emmeline had wandered away from the group, drawn by the glitter of sunlight on the lake's surface. She had leaned too far over the water's edge, her foot slipping on moss-covered stone. The shock of cold water closing over her head, the weight of her dress pulling her down, the burning in her lungs as she fought to surface, and then strong hands gripping her arms, hauling her upward. She had broken the surface gasping, water streaming from her hair and gown. Her rescuer had pulled her to shore, his voice low and steady as he said, "You're safe now." She had tried to see his face, to thank him properly, but he had already stepped back into the shadows of overhanging trees. By the time she had caught her breath and looked around, he was gone. No one at the gathering seemed to know who had saved her, and in the commotion that followed, the incident had faded into family lore, a story told and half forgotten. But Emmeline remembered that voice, deep and certain, carrying the kind of authority that made her believe his words absolutely. She had felt safe in that moment, truly safe, in a way she had not felt since. She had never felt that way again. Until she met Lord Marlowe, she would have no way of knowing whether marriage would bring safety or something far darker. But the cold dread settling in her bones suggested she already knew the answer. Dear listener, if you're enjoying Emmeline and Julian's journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every subscription helps us continue creating these immersive historical romances for you. Your support means the world to us. Now let us discover what happens when Julian Davenport learns of Emmeline's forced betrothal. The morning after Emmeline sealed her letter to Constance, she carried it herself to the village post. The walk through autumn crisp fields gave her time to think, though her thoughts circled endlessly around the trap closing around her. She could not eat. She could not sleep. The weight of Theodore's pronouncement pressed against her chest, until breathing itself became an effort of will. By the time she returned to Fairmont House, a reply from Constance had already arrived. Emmeline tore it open in her chamber, hands shaking. The words were brief and devastating. Constance's husband had intercepted the original letter. He forbade any assistance, threatening to sever their friendship entirely if Constance defied him. The note ended with a single line that broke Emmeline's heart. "Forgive me. You deserved better than this." Emmeline sank onto her bed, the letter crumpling in her fist. She was truly alone. What Emmeline could not know was that Constance, though forbidden to intervene openly, did not let the matter rest. That same afternoon she summoned a maid she trusted and dictated a second letter, this one unsigned and addressed not to Emmeline, but to a man whose influence might actually alter the course of events. The Duke of Northcliffe. Meanwhile, 3 hours distant in London, Julian Davenport, Duke of Northcliffe, sat in his study reviewing parliamentary documents when his butler entered carrying a silver salver. "A letter arrived by special courier, Your Grace," the man said, extending the tray. Julian took the envelope, noting immediately that it bore no seal or return direction. Inside, the handwriting was careful and plain, the words of someone unaccustomed to corresponding with nobility. "Your Grace," it began, "I write to inform you of a grave injustice being perpetrated against a lady of quality. Lady Emmeline Fairmont, daughter of the late Viscount Fairmont, has been sold in marriage to Lord Victor Marlowe by her uncle and guardian, Theodore Fairmont. The contract was signed without the lady's consent or knowledge. Lord Marlowe is known among household staff to be a man of cruel temperament. His first wife died under circumstances that were never properly investigated. I beg you, as a man of honour and influence, to intervene if you are able. The wedding is set for 3 weeks hence. The letter was unsigned. Julian read it 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass. Lady E.F. Emmeline Fairmont. The initials had stirred something in his memory the moment he saw them, but now the full name brought everything into sharp focus. He rose and moved to the window overlooking the London street below. Carriages rattled past. Vendors called their wares. The ordinary business of the city continued, unaware that Julian's carefully ordered world had just tilted on its axis. Emmeline Fairmont. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in 10 years, but he had never forgotten it. Could never forget it. The summer of 1814. Julian had been 22, newly returned from Oxford, and chafing under the weight of responsibilities his father's recent death had placed upon his shoulders. The neighbouring Fairmont family had organised a picnic on the grounds of Northcliffe Estate, a tradition his mother had encouraged to maintain good relations with nearby families. Julian had attended out of duty, standing apart from the festivities, watching the proceedings with the detachment that had already begun to define him. Then he had heard the splash and the screams. The Fairmont girl, perhaps 16, had fallen into the lake. Her heavy dress dragged her down instantly. Julian had not thought, merely acted, diving into the cold water and swimming hard toward where she had disappeared beneath the surface. He had found her in the murky darkness, grasped her arms, and hauled her upward. When they broke the surface, she had gasped and choked, water streaming from her hair. He had pulled her to shore, laid her on the grass, made certain she was breathing properly. "You're safe now," he had told her, his voice rough from exertion. She had tried to look at him, to thank him, but the sun had been in her eyes, and he had stepped back into shadow. The commotion of servants and family members arriving had given him the opportunity to slip away before being identified. He had returned to the house and changed his clothes, telling no one what had occurred, but he had learned her name. Emmeline. And in the years that followed, he had made quiet inquiries through mutual acquaintances. Not obsessively, not intrusively, simply ensuring that she was well, that life treated her kindly. He had learned of her father's long illness, of how she had devoted herself to his care, sacrificing her own prospects to ease his suffering, of how the Fairmont fortune had been spent on physicians and treatments that ultimately proved futile. And now this, sold to Victor Marlowe. Julian's hands clenched into fists. He knew Marlowe by reputation, a man who had made his fortune through gambling establishments that operated in the shadows of legality. Marlowe moved in circles that brushed against nobility without quite belonging to it, always seeking to elevate his status through marriage or association. Julian summoned his secretary immediately. "I need everything you can find on Lord Victor Marlowe," he instructed. Financial records, property holdings, legal disputes, rumours, everything. And confirm the details of this marriage contract with Theodore Fairmont. The secretary, accustomed to his employer's occasional requests for discreet investigation, bowed and departed. Within 2 days, Julian had his answers. The marriage contract was real and legally binding. Marlowe had indeed purchased Theodore Fairmont's considerable gambling debts from several creditors, then offered to forgive them in exchange for Emmeline's hand. Theodore had signed immediately, but the most disturbing information concerned Marlowe himself. His first wife, Lady Helena Marlowe, had died 3 years prior after a fall down the stairs of their London townhouse. The inquest had ruled it accidental, but servants had whispered of arguments, of bruises they had seen on Lady Helena in the weeks before her death. Julian made his decision. He would intervene. That evening, he attended his club, knowing Marlowe frequented the card rooms there. He found the man easily enough, seated at a table with 3 other gentlemen, a glass of brandy at his elbow. Victor Marlowe was 45, his appearance elegant in the manner of men who pay careful attention to their dress without quite achieving true refinement. His hair was greying at the temples, his face handsome in a sharp, predatory way. When he smiled, it never reached his eyes. Julian approached the table. Conversation died instantly as the other men recognized him. "Your Grace," Marlowe said, rising and bowing. "What an unexpected honor." "Lord Marlowe," Julian replied coolly. "Might I have a word in private?" Marlowe's smile tightened fractionally, but he nodded. "Of course." They moved to a quieter corner of the club, away from curious ears. Julian did not waste time on pleasantries. "I understand you have entered into a marriage contract with Miss Emmeline Fairmont," he said. Marlowe's eyebrows rose. "Indeed I have, though I confess surprise that such a matter would interest your Grace. The Fairmont family are neighbours of mine in the country," Julian replied, the lie smooth and practiced. "I have some concern about the circumstances of this arrangement." "The circumstances are straightforward," Marlowe said, his tone sharpening. "Theodore Fairmont owed me a considerable sum. I have agreed to forgive those debts in exchange for his niece's hand in marriage. All perfectly legal and proper." "I would like to purchase those debts from you," Julian said. "Name your price." Marlowe studied him for a long moment, and something calculating entered his expression. "The debts are no longer for sale, Your Grace. The contract has been signed. Every debt has a price. Not this one." Marlowe's smile returned, colder than before. "You see, I want Miss Fairmont specifically. She resembles someone I once knew, someone who made the mistake of rejecting me publicly many years ago. I do not forget such slights. And I do not bargain when I have already secured what I desire." The admission was so casually cruel that for a moment Julian could not speak. Marlowe wanted Emmeline not for love or even practical advantage, but as a proxy for some ancient revenge against another woman entirely. "You cannot be serious," Julian said quietly. "I am entirely serious. Miss Fairmont will make a satisfactory wife. She is past the age of foolish romanticism and will be appropriately grateful for my generosity in overlooking her lack of fortune and faded prospects." Marlowe finished his brandy. "Now, if you will excuse me, Your Grace, I have a game to return to." He walked away before Julian could respond, leaving the Duke standing alone with impotent fury burning in his chest. The direct approach had failed. Marlowe would not be reasoned with or bought off, which meant Julian would need to find another way. That same evening, Emmeline sat across from Lord Marlowe at dinner, Theodore beaming between them as though he had arranged a love match rather than a transaction. The dining room of Fairmont House had been cleaned and the best remaining silver polished for the occasion, a pathetic attempt to maintain appearances. Marlowe had arrived precisely on time, his manner courteous and correct. He had bowed over Emmeline's hand, his lips brushing her knuckles in a gesture that made her skin crawl. Now she watched him cut his meat with precise movements, his conversation with Theodore ranging over business matters and London gossip. He barely looked at her, except when Theodore prompted him to do so. "My niece is accomplished in all the domestic arts," Theodore was saying. "She managed this household for years while caring for her father. You will find her most capable." "I'm certain I will," Marlowe replied, finally turning his attention fully to Emmeline. His gaze moved over her face in a way that felt proprietary, assessing. "Tell me, Miss Fairmont, have you spent much time in London?" "Very little, my lord," Emmeline said quietly. "My father's illness required me to remain in the country." A dutiful daughter. Admirable. Marlowe reached across the table and took her hand before she could pull away. His grip was firm, just shy of painful. "I expect similar devotion in a wife, obedience, gratitude. You understand, I'm certain, that I am doing your family a great service by accepting you despite your advanced years and lack of dowry." Emmeline met his eyes and saw the cruelty Theodore had tried to hide. This man did not want a wife. He wanted a possession, something he could control and diminish at will. "I understand perfectly, my lord," she said, pulling her hand free. Marlowe smiled, apparently satisfied with her submission. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and growing dread. By the time Marlowe departed, Emmeline felt nauseated and hollow. She returned to her chamber and stood at the window, staring out at the darkened grounds. Somewhere out there, beyond these walls, there had to be a way to escape. but every door she tried had closed in her face. She did not know that 3 hours away, a duke who had never forgotten her voice was already planning her rescue. The days following Emmeline's disastrous dinner with Lord Marlowe passed in a haze of mounting desperation. She had exhausted every avenue of escape she could imagine, and each door had slammed shut in her face. On the third morning after Marlowe's visit, Emmeline woke to find that Theodore had entered her chamber while she slept. Her mother's jewellery box, the last remaining item of value she possessed, sat open and empty on her dressing table. She found her uncle in the dining room, calmly eating his breakfast. "You took my mother's jewels," Emmeline said, her voice trembling with fury she could no longer contain. Theodore did not look up from his newspaper. "They were never yours to begin with. Your mother's property became your father's upon marriage, and upon his death, passed to me as head of the family. I have sold them to cover immediate expenses. Those were all I had left of her. Sentiment is a luxury we can no longer afford," Theodore replied, turning a page. "The sale will provide funds for your trousseau. Lord Marlowe expects his bride to be properly attired." Emmeline's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I tried to sell those jewels myself to secure passage from here. You prevented it. Now you sell them for the very wedding I wish to escape." "Your wishes are irrelevant," Theodore said, finally meeting her eyes. The coldness she saw there chilled her to the bone. "You will marry Lord Marlowe in precisely 1 week. The date has been moved forward at his request." "1 week?" The words came out as a whisper. "But you said 3 weeks. That was our agreement. Lord Marlowe's arrangements have changed. The wedding will take place at his private chapel. All has been prepared." Theodore folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. "I suggest you spend the intervening days preparing yourself mentally for your new role. Lord Marlowe is not a patient man, and he expects obedience from those under his authority." Emmeline felt the walls closing in around her. 1 week. 7 days until she became the property of a man whose eyes held nothing but cruelty and calculation. She turned and fled the dining room, Theodore's indifferent gaze following her departure. In London, Julian Davenport stood in his study, reviewing reports from the investigator he had hired immediately after his confrontation with Marlowe. What he read confirmed his worst fears. Lord Victor Marlowe owned 3 gambling establishments that operated in legal grey areas. His wealth came primarily from these ventures, supplemented by investments in shipping ventures of questionable legitimacy. More disturbing were the accounts from former servants of the Marlowe household. A footman, dismissed without reference after Lady Helena's death, spoke of violent arguments between Marlowe and his wife. A lady's maid described bruises she had seen on Lady Helena's arms and neck in the weeks before her fatal fall. The physician who had examined the body noted injuries inconsistent with a simple tumble downstairs, but had been pressured by Marlowe's solicitor to sign the death certificate without further investigation. Julian set down the reports, his jaw tight with barely controlled rage. Marlowe was not merely cruel, he was dangerous, and Emmeline would be entirely at his mercy within the confines of marriage. The investigator's most recent update lay atop the pile. The wedding date had been moved forward to 1 week hence. Marlowe's reasons were unclear, but the investigator suspected the man had learned of Julian's inquiries and wished to secure his prize before interference could occur. Julian called for his secretary immediately. "I need you to locate every creditor who originally held Theodore Fairmont's debts," Julian instructed. "Determine which ones sold those debts to Marlowe and arrange meetings with them. I want to purchase the original debt contracts directly from the source. Your Grace, if Lord Marlowe already holds those contracts, the original creditors may not have authority to sell." "Then we will find another way," Julian said. "Research the legal requirements. If Marlowe acquired those debts through any irregularity, any technicality that might invalidate his claim, I want to know about it." The secretary departed to begin his work, and Julian turned his attention to the second problem. Even if he could invalidate Marlowe's hold on the Fairmont debts, Theodore could simply find another buyer, another man willing to purchase a reluctant bride. The only permanent solution would be to eliminate the debts entirely. Julian penned a letter to his banker, instructing him to prepare funds sufficient to purchase all of Theodore Fairmont's outstanding obligations. It would be a significant sum, but Julian's fortune could absorb it. The difficulty lay in executing the transaction before the wedding took place. 1 week. It was not enough time. That evening, as Julian paced his study trying to formulate a plan that would work within such a compressed time frame, his younger brother Edmund arrived unannounced. "You look terrible," Edmund observed, dropping into a chair without invitation. "What has you so agitated?" Julian hesitated, then decided his brother deserved the truth. He explained the situation in brief, clinical terms. When he finished, Edmund's usual air of amused indifference had vanished. "Let me understand this correctly," Edmund said slowly. "You are contemplating a direct assault on a man's legal marriage contract because of a woman you met once, 10 years ago, for approximately 3 minutes. I saved her life," Julian replied. "That creates an obligation. An obligation to ensure her welfare, perhaps. Not to upend your entire life for her sake." Edmund leaned forward. "Julian, if you interfere in this marriage and word spreads of your interest in Miss Fairmont, your own reputation will be compromised. Society will assume improper motivations. The scandal could be substantial. I am aware of the risks." "Are you?" "Because from where I sit, you are behaving in a manner entirely foreign to the careful, calculated brother I have known all my life." Edmund's expression softened slightly. "What is it about this woman that has you acting so rashly?" Julian moved to the window, staring out at the darkening London street. "When I pulled her from that lake, I saw something in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also determination. She thanked me even as she struggled to breathe, as though politeness mattered more than her own distress. And in the years since, every report I have received has confirmed what I suspected then. She is good, Edmund. Genuinely good in a way that few people are. She sacrificed her youth to care for her father. She manages a failing household with dignity. And now she is being sold to a monster because her uncle is too weak and selfish to protect her." "So this is about justice," Edmund said. "This is about preventing a tragedy I have the power to stop." Edmund was silent for a long moment. Finally, he stood and moved to stand beside his brother at the window. "Then we had best work quickly," Edmund said, "because 1 week is not much time to save a damsel from a dragon." The next morning, both brothers departed for the country. Julian had made his decision. If legal means would not work within the required time frame, he would need to take more direct action. But first, he needed to see Emmeline again, to confirm that she was truly the woman he remembered, and that she genuinely needed rescue rather than merely being a victim of his imagination and misplaced nostalgia. The journey to the Fairmont estate took most of the day. Julian and Edmund arrived as afternoon shadows lengthened across the countryside. They did not approach the house directly, instead taking rooms at the village inn and setting out on horseback the following morning. Julian knew the area well from his youth. The Fairmont property bordered Northcliffe lands, separated by a stretch of woods and the lake where he had pulled Emmeline from the water all those years ago. He guided them along little-used paths until they reached a vantage point overlooking the Fairmont Gardens. The house showed signs of neglect. Paint peeled from window frames. The gardens had grown wild in places, though someone had made efforts to maintain the areas closest to the main building. It was the home of a family sliding toward genteel poverty, holding on to respectability by their fingernails. "There," Edmund murmured, pointing. A woman had emerged from the house, walking slowly through the overgrown garden. Even at this distance, Julian recognized her. Emmeline Fairmont, 10 years older than the girl he had saved, but unmistakably the same person. She wore a simple day dress of pale green, her dark hair pinned up loosely. She moved among the rose bushes that had gone half wild, touching petals absently as though seeking comfort in their beauty. There was something profoundly lonely about the scene, a solitary figure in a neglected paradise. As Julian watched, Emmeline sank onto a stone bench, her shoulders slumping in a posture of defeat he had never seen in her before. She pressed her hands to her face, and even from this distance, he could see her shoulders shake with silent sobs. The sight struck him in the chest like a physical blow. "We need to move quickly," Julian said, his voice rough. The wedding is in 6 days. The day before Emmeline's wedding dawned grey and cold. She woke before sunrise, the weight of inevitability pressing down upon her chest until breathing felt like labour. In less than 24 hours, she would belong to Lord Victor Marlowe. The thought made her stomach turn. A knock at her chamber door announced the arrival of 3 women sent by Marlowe himself. They were seamstresses and ladies' maids from his household, come to prepare her for the ceremony. The eldest introduced herself as Mrs. Graves, her manner professional but not unkind. "Lord Marlowe has sent your wedding attire," Mrs. Graves said, gesturing for the other women to bring in several large boxes. "He wishes you to be dressed appropriately for your new station." Emmeline watched as they unpacked the gown. It was exquisite. She could not deny that. White silk embroidered with pearls, the bodice fitted precisely to measurements she had never provided. The realization that Marlowe had somehow obtained her measurements without her knowledge sent a chill down her spine. "It is lovely," she managed to say. "His lordship has excellent taste," Mrs. Graves replied, laying out matching slippers, gloves, and an elaborate veil. "He has thought of every detail." That, Emmeline reflected, was precisely what frightened her. A man who controlled every detail was not one who would tolerate independence or resistance in a wife. She submitted to being measured again, fitted, primped, and instructed on how she would wear her hair the following day. Through it all, she maintained the composed mask she had perfected over years of managing a dying father and hostile uncle. But inside, panic clawed at her throat. When the women finally departed, promising to return at dawn, Emmeline sank onto her bed, still wearing the wedding gown they had insisted she try on one final time. The silk felt like a shroud. A soft knock made her look up. Theodore stood in her doorway, holding a leather folder. "I have come to review the final arrangements," he said, entering without invitation. He laid out documents on her writing desk. "The marriage contract. You will sign it after the ceremony, making the union legally binding." Emmeline forced herself to approach the desk. She scanned the document, her heart sinking with each line. Upon marriage, all property that had been her father's would transfer to Marlowe's control. The Fairmont estate, the title, everything would become his, absolutely. "You have sold me and everything I might have inherited," she said quietly. "I have saved this family from ruin," Theodore corrected. "Lord Marlowe is generous to accept such a burden." "A burden?" Emmeline looked at her uncle. "Is that what I am to you?" For a moment, something that might have been shame flickered across Theodore's face. But it vanished quickly, replaced by defensive anger. "You are 26 years old, with no prospects and no fortune. What did you imagine your future held? Spinsterhood, becoming a governess and living on charity?" He gathered the documents roughly. "Lord Marlowe offers you position, security, a life of comfort. You should be grateful. Has he hurt women before?" The question came out before Emmeline could stop it. Theodore froze. "What nonsense have you been filling your head with? His first wife died under suspicious circumstances. Everyone knows it, even if no one speaks of it openly. Lady Helena's death was an accident, thoroughly investigated and ruled as such." Theodore's voice hardened. "You will not speak of this again. Lord Marlowe is a respectable man of business. These rumours are nothing more than servants' gossip." But Emmeline could see the lie in her uncle's eyes. He knew Marlowe was dangerous, and he was sending her to him anyway, because the alternative was Theodore's own financial ruin. "I will not sign that contract," Emmeline said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Theodore's face flushed. "You will sign, or I will have you declared mentally unfit and sign as your guardian. Either way, the marriage proceeds. The only question is whether you maintain any dignity in the process." He left before she could respond, taking the documents with him. Emmeline stood alone in her chamber, the wedding gown rustling around her with each breath. She moved to her writing desk and withdrew fresh parchment. Her father's desk, her mother's pen. She had one last message to write. The letter to her father, though he had been dead 6 months, poured from her heart. She asked his forgiveness for not being strong enough to escape, for failing to protect the legacy he had built. She told him she had tried truly tried. But every avenue had closed before her. She sealed the letter and placed it in the drawer with her mother's miniature. Perhaps someday someone would find it and understand that she had not gone willingly into this marriage. As darkness fell, Emmeline changed from the wedding gown into her nightdress. She should sleep, prepare herself for what tomorrow would bring. But sleep felt impossible. Instead, she stood at her window, watching moonlight silver the neglected gardens below. A movement caught her eye. For a moment, she thought she glimpsed a figure standing at the edge of the woods beyond the garden. But when she blinked, there was nothing. A trick of moonlight and desperate imagination. She was utterly alone. Meanwhile, Julian Davenport sat in the private parlour of the village inn, reviewing documents by candlelight while Edmund paced restlessly. "The timing is impossible," Edmund said for perhaps the 10th time that evening. "Even if we leave before dawn, reach Marlowe's chapel by noon, what then? You cannot simply burst into a wedding and demand they stop." "I can and will," Julian replied, not looking up from the papers spread before him. These documents prove that Marlowe obtained Theodore Fairmont's debts through irregular means. 3 of the original creditors have confirmed they sold to intermediaries, not directly to Marlowe. The chain of ownership is legally questionable. Legally questionable is not the same as legally invalid, Edmund pointed out. And even if you invalidate Marlowe's hold on the debts, Theodore could sell Emmeline to another bidder within days, which is why I have purchased the original debts myself through those same intermediaries. Julian finally looked up, his grey eyes determined. "As of this afternoon, I hold Theodore Fairmont's obligations. Legally, Marlowe has no claim to enforce the marriage contract." Edmund stopped pacing. "You bought the debts, all of them, every penny. That must have cost a fortune." "It did." Julian returned his attention to the documents. "And it was worth every shilling." Edmund studied his brother for a long moment. "You truly care for her. This woman you met once, 10 years ago." "I saved her life once," Julian said quietly. "I will not stand by and watch her be destroyed because I was too cowardly to act a second time." "This is not cowardice we are correcting, brother. This is fate." Edmund moved to pour them both brandy. "What will you do after you stop the wedding, assuming you succeed?" "I will ensure she is safe. Beyond that, I have not planned. Society will assume the worst. A duke who prevents another man's wedding to claim the bride for himself. There will be scandal. Let them talk." Edmund handed Julian a glass. "And if she does not want your protection? If she prefers independence to trading one form of obligation for another?" Julian had considered this possibility during the long days of preparation. It was entirely possible that Emmeline would see him as another man seeking to control her, to impose his will upon her life. "Then I will give her the means to be independent," he said. "Money, a house, security, whatever she needs to build a life on her own terms." "You would do that? Walk away after everything?" "I want her safe and free," Julian replied simply. "Whether that includes me or not is her choice to make." Edmund raised his glass in salute. "Then let us ensure she has the opportunity to make it. We ride at dawn." The morning of Emmeline's wedding arrived wrapped in mist and silence. She woke before the servants, her body refusing the comfort of sleep any longer. Through her window, she watched dawn break slowly over the countryside, pale light filtering through clouds that promised rain before day's end. Mrs. Graves and her assistants arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, their arms laden with boxes and tools of their trade. They worked with quiet efficiency, transforming Emmeline from a woman facing her doom into something that resembled a bride. The white silk gown settled over her like a weight. The pearls at her throat felt like a collar. "You make a beautiful bride, miss," Mrs. Graves said softly as she arranged the veil. There was genuine sympathy in the older woman's eyes. "Lord Marlowe will be pleased." Emmeline said nothing. What was there to say? That she would rather die than marry the man waiting for her at his private chapel. That every instinct screamed at her to run, even knowing there was nowhere to go. She had exhausted every option, burned every bridge. This marriage was inevitable. At 9:30, Theodore appeared at her door. He wore his finest coat, looking more prosperous than he had in months. Marlowe's money had already begun flowing into his coffers, Emmeline realised. Her uncle had sold her and was already spending the proceeds. "The carriage is ready," Theodore announced. "Lord Marlowe's chapel is an hour's journey. We must depart immediately." Emmeline rose from her seat, the silk of her gown whispering with the movement. She caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognised the woman staring back, pale, hollow-eyed, dressed for a funeral, masquerading as a wedding. The journey to Marlowe's estate passed in a blur. Theodore made occasional attempts at conversation, but Emmeline could not bring herself to respond. She watched the countryside roll past, memorising every tree and hill, as though committing her freedom to memory before it disappeared forever. Marlowe's property, when they arrived, proved as imposing as the man himself. The main house stood atop a hill, all dark stone and narrow windows. The private chapel sat apart from it, a smaller structure of grey stone surrounded by ancient yews that blocked out much of the daylight. Inside, the chapel was cold and dim, despite the candles burning at the altar. Perhaps 20 guests occupied the pews, most of them men Emmeline did not recognise. Business associates of Marlowe's, she assumed. Witnesses to his acquisition of a respectable family name and a wife he could mould to his liking. Lord Marlowe stood at the altar, dressed in black superfine, his expression satisfied as he watched Emmeline enter on Theodore's arm. His eyes moved over her like a merchant inspecting purchased goods, and she fought the urge to flee. The rector, an elderly man with kind eyes that could not quite hide his discomfort, nodded to Theodore and Emmeline as they approached. Theodore deposited her at Marlowe's side as though delivering a parcel, then retreated to sit in the front pew. Marlowe took her hand. His grip was tight, possessive, his fingers cold through the silk of her gloves. "You look acceptable," he murmured, leaning close enough that only she could hear. "I trust you understand the expectations I have for your behaviour as my wife. Obedience, deference, and gratitude. Fail in any of these, and you will learn that I can be most unpleasant when displeased." Emmeline's stomach turned, but she forced herself to nod. What choice did she have? The rector opened his prayer book and began. The words washed over Emmeline like cold water. "Dearly beloved, gathered here in the sight of God." She heard none of it, her mind frantically searching for escape even now, even knowing there was none. The rector's voice droned on through familiar liturgy. Marlowe's hand remained clamped around hers, as though he feared she might bolt if given the slightest opportunity. She probably would have, had there been anywhere to run. "If any person present knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage," the rector intoned, his voice carrying through the stone chapel, "let them speak now, or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed felt absolute. 3 seconds. 4. Emmeline closed her eyes, accepting her fate. Then, like thunder rolling across distant hills, she heard it. Hoofbeats, coming fast. Marlowe's hand tightened painfully around hers. "Continue," he snapped at the rector. But the elderly man had paused, his attention drawn to the chapel doors. Everyone had turned to look as the sound grew louder. The doors burst open with a crash that echoed off stone walls. A rider on a massive black horse burst into the chapel, scattering guests who scrambled from the pews in alarm. The animal's hooves struck sparks from the stone floor as its rider drove it hard down the centre aisle. Julian Davenport, Duke of Northcliffe, sat astride the animal with perfect control, his grey eyes fixed on the altar. He wore riding clothes, his dark hair windswept, his expression carved from stone and fury. He looked like some ancient knight riding to war, magnificent and terrible. He brought the horse to a halt directly in front of the altar, so close that it could have touched Marlowe with its nose. The animal snorted, nostrils flaring, sensing its rider's barely controlled rage. Marlowe released Emmeline's hand and stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "What is the meaning of this outrage? How dare you interrupt my wedding?" Julian dismounted in one fluid movement, his boots striking the floor with authority. He withdrew a leather folder from inside his coat and threw it at Marlowe's feet. "This wedding is built on fraud," Julian announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel. Lord Marlowe claims to hold Theodore Fairmont's debts as leverage for this marriage. But those debts were obtained through illegal means. The original creditors had no authority to sell to the intermediaries Marlowe used. The chain of ownership is invalid. Marlowe bent and snatched up the folder, scanning the documents inside with growing fury. This is nonsense. Legal technicalities mean nothing. The contract is signed. The contract is void, Julian countered. Because I hold the legitimate debts. I purchased them directly from the original creditors 3 days ago. Theodore Fairmont owes me, not you. You have no legal claim to enforce this marriage. Murmurs rippled through the assembled guests. Theodore had risen from his pew, his face pale. Emmeline stood frozen at the altar, unable to process what was happening. Marlowe's composure cracked. You think you can simply buy your way into this situation? Who do you even think you are? Julian Davenport, Duke of Northcliffe, Julian replied coldly. And I am ending this farce before it goes any further. He turned his attention from Marlowe to Emmeline for the first time since entering the chapel. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that Emmeline could not name. His gaze was intense, but not unkind, concerned, but not pitying. Miss Fairmont, he said, and his voice gentled considerably. You do not have to do this. The words struck Emmeline like a physical blow. She had been so certain there was no escape, no alternative, no hope. And now this man, this stranger, had ridden into her wedding like something from a fairy tale and offered her freedom. But then his voice penetrated her shock, low and steady, carrying absolute certainty. You're safe now. The words hit Emmeline like lightning. Her breath caught. She knew that voice, had heard it once, 10 years ago, as water closed over her head and strong hands pulled her from drowning. Had remembered it every day since, a promise of safety she thought she would never hear again. You, she breathed, staring at him. It was you. Recognition flashed in Julian's eyes. Acknowledgement that she understood who he was, what he had been to her all those years ago. Marlowe's control shattered completely. She is mine, he roared, lunging toward Emmeline. The contract is signed. She will marry me today. Julian moved faster, positioning himself between Marlowe and Emmeline. Touch her, and I will kill you where you stand. The threat was delivered in such a calm, matter-of-fact tone that no one doubted he meant it. Marlowe froze, seeming to calculate his odds against a younger, stronger opponent. This is kidnapping, Marlowe snarled instead, turning to the assembled guests. You all witness that the Duke of Northcliffe has entered private property and is attempting to abduct my bride. Your bride signed nothing, Julian replied. She made no vows. And according to English law, a marriage contract obtained through fraudulent debt claims is invalid. You have no legal hold over her. He turned back to Emmeline, his hand extended. Come with me. You do not have to stay here. You do not have to marry him. Emmeline stared at that offered hand. Behind her, Marlowe vibrated with barely contained violence. Theodore had begun protesting loudly about family obligations and signed agreements. The guests murmured and shifted, uncertain whether to intervene or flee. But all Emmeline could see was the man who had saved her once before, offering salvation a second time. She took his hand. The touch sent electricity through her entire body. Julian's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and certain. He pulled her gently toward him, away from Marlowe, away from the altar and the vows that would have destroyed her. Marlowe lunged forward, trying to grab Emmeline's other arm. Julian moved with speed that belied his size, releasing Emmeline's hand just long enough to deliver a single, precise punch to Marlowe's jaw. The man crumpled, falling backward into the rector, who barely managed to catch him. Before anyone else could react, Julian swept Emmeline up into his arms as though she weighed nothing. The world spun as he carried her toward the massive horse waiting in the aisle. He set her on the saddle with surprising gentleness, then mounted behind her in one fluid motion. His arms came around her to grasp the reins, caging her securely against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding, or perhaps that was her own heart, or both their hearts beating in frantic synchrony. Hold on, he murmured against her ear. Then he spurred the horse forward, and they were flying. The chapel doors exploded outward as Julian's horse burst through them into grey morning light. Behind them, shouts erupted, Marlowe's voice rising above the rest in incoherent fury. But Julian did not slow, guiding his mount down the gravel drive and into the woods beyond with sure-footed speed. Emmeline clung to the horse's mane, her wedding veil tearing free and streaming behind them like a banner of white silk. The world blurred around her, trees and sky spinning together as they raced through the forest. Julian's arms remained steady around her, one hand controlling the reins while the other pressed against her waist, keeping her secure against his chest. She could feel the heat of him through her gown, the solid strength of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Her mind reeled, unable to process what had just occurred. One moment she had been standing at the altar, accepting her fate. The next, this man had appeared like something from legend and carried her away. After what felt like hours but could only have been 20 minutes of hard riding, Julian slowed the horse to a walk. They had left Marlowe's property far behind, entering lands Emmeline did not recognize. The woods here grew thick and old, towering oaks creating a canopy that filtered the morning light into shifting patterns of shadow and gold. Julian guided the horse off the main path onto a barely visible track that wound deeper into the forest. Eventually, they emerged into a small clearing where a modest hunting lodge stood, smoke rising from its chimney. Edmund Davenport appeared at the door as they approached, relief evident on his face. "Thank God. I was beginning to worry Marlowe had shot you." "He tried," Julian replied, dismounting before reaching up to help Emmeline down. His hands were gentle at her waist as he lowered her to the ground. Her legs nearly buckled, and he steadied her immediately. "Are you hurt?" Emmeline shook her head, unable to find words. Now that the immediate danger had passed, shock was setting in. She began to tremble, great shuddering waves that she could not control. "Get her inside," Edmund said quietly. "She is in shock." Julian swept Emmeline into his arms once more and carried her into the lodge. The interior was simple but comfortable, a single large room dominated by a stone fireplace where a cheerful fire burned. He deposited her gently in a chair near the hearth and immediately draped his riding coat around her shoulders. Edmund pressed a glass of brandy into her hands. "Drink. It will help." Emmeline obeyed mechanically, coughing as the liquid burned down her throat. Warmth spread through her chest, and gradually her trembling eased. She became aware of Julian kneeling beside her chair, his grey eyes searching her face with concern. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I gave you no warning, no time to prepare, but I could not risk Marlowe completing the ceremony before I arrived. You saved me." The words came out as a whisper. Emmeline met his gaze directly, seeing him clearly for the first time. He was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and intensity. But there was kindness in his eyes, and something else. Recognition. "You saved me 10 years ago," she continued. "At the lake. I never saw your face, but I knew your voice. I have remembered it every day since." Julian's expression softened. "Yes, I pulled you from the water that summer. I had hoped you would not remember. How could I forget?" Emmeline's hand found his where it rested on the chair arm. "You told me I was safe, and then you disappeared before I could thank you." "I thought it better to remain anonymous," Julian admitted. "I was young and foolish and convinced that my duty to my new title mattered more than being thanked for a simple act of decency. There was nothing simple about it. You saved my life." Emmeline felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "And now you have saved me again. From a fate that would have destroyed me." Julian's hand turned beneath hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. "When I learned what your uncle had done, selling you to Marlowe to cover his debts, I could not stand idle. I made inquiries about Marlowe. What I discovered convinced me that you were in genuine danger. His first wife," Emmeline said softly, "died under circumstances that were never properly investigated," Julian confirmed. "I could not allow the same fate to befall you." Edmund cleared his throat from across the room. "While this reunion is touching, we need to discuss practical matters. Marlowe will not accept this quietly. He has been publicly humiliated, His pride and his pocketbook have both been damaged. He will seek revenge. Julian rose, though he kept Emmeline's hand in his. I have legal documentation proving that Marlowe's claim to Theodore Fairmont's debts was fraudulent. Those debts belong to me now, purchased legitimately from the original creditors. Marlowe has no grounds to enforce the marriage contract. Legal grounds and actual law are not always the same thing, Edmund pointed out, especially when dealing with a man of Marlowe's temperament. He may try to claim kidnapping, coercion, breach of contract. The courts could be tied up for months sorting through the legalities. Then let them, Julian said firmly. I have documentation, witnesses, proof of purchase. Marlowe's case will fail. Perhaps, Edmund conceded. But in the meantime, what becomes of Miss Fairmont? She cannot return to her uncle's house. Marlowe knows where she lives and would have no compunction about dragging her back by force. The question hung in the air. Emmeline felt Julian's hand tighten slightly around hers, as though he feared she might vanish if he released her. Miss Fairmont will remain under my protection, Julian said. This property belongs to my family. It is secure and isolated. She will be safe here while I handle the legal matters. And her reputation? Edmund asked quietly. Brother, I support what you have done, but we must face facts. An unmarried woman staying in an isolated hunting lodge with an unmarried duke, even with servants present, will cause scandal. Society will assume the worst. Julian's jaw tightened. I care very little what society assumes. But Miss Fairmont might, Edmund replied, his gaze shifting to Emmeline. You have just escaped one form of imprisonment. We do not wish to trap you in another. Emmeline found both men looking at her, waiting for her response. She took a shaking breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered like leaves in wind. I do not care about scandal, she said finally. My reputation has been in tatters since my father died and left us penniless. Theodore selling me to Marlowe simply finished what poverty began. She looked up at Julian. But I also do not wish to be a burden to you, Your Grace. You have already done more for me than I have any right to expect. If there is another option, someplace I could go where Marlowe could not find me, there is no place safer than here, Julian said firmly. And you are not a burden. You are a woman who has been gravely wronged by men who should have protected you. I will not add to that wrong by abandoning you now. Then what do you propose? Emmeline asked. Julian knelt beside her chair again, bringing himself to her eye level. His expression was earnest, almost vulnerable in a way that surprised her. I propose honesty, he said. I will explain exactly what I have done, what the situation is, and what options are available to you. Then you will decide what happens next. No more men making choices for you. No more contracts signed without your knowledge or consent. Emmeline felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. I am listening. Julian outlined the situation with admirable clarity. He had purchased all of Theodore Fairmont's debts through legitimate channels, which meant Theodore now owed him rather than Marlowe. The marriage contract was void because Marlowe no longer held the leverage that had prompted Theodore to sign it in the first place. Legally, you are free, Julian explained, but practically, you face several challenges. Your uncle remains your legal guardian until you marry or reach 30. He could attempt to arrange another marriage contract with another buyer, though I would contest any such attempt. Marlowe, meanwhile, has been humiliated and will likely seek revenge in some form. So I am free in theory but not in practice, Emmeline said. Precisely. Julian's expression turned grave, which is why I offer you 3 options. First, you could go abroad. I have connections in France and Italy. I could arrange safe passage, secure housing, and sufficient funds for you to live independently under an assumed name. You would have freedom, but would need to remain hidden. The second option. You could remain here in England under my protection. I would provide a house, servants, whatever you needed to live comfortably. But as Edmund pointed out, society would make assumptions. Your reputation would suffer further. Emmeline studied his face. And the third option? Julian hesitated, and for the first time since entering the chapel, he looked uncertain. Marriage. To me. It would solve the legal complications immediately. As my Duchess, you would be beyond Theodore's authority or Marlowe's reach. Your social position would be unassailable, but I would be trading one cage for another, Emmeline said quietly. No, Julian's response was immediate and fierce. I would never cage you. The marriage would be in name only if you wished it. Separate bedchambers, complete autonomy over your own time and choices. I would ask nothing from you beyond the legal formality of being my wife. Emmeline stared at him, searching his face for deception or ulterior motive. She found only sincerity and something deeper, something that looked almost like longing quickly suppressed. Why would you do this? She asked. You barely know me. Why risk your reputation, your peace, your entire life to help me? Julian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. Because 10 years ago, I held you in my arms as you struggled to breathe. And I swore to myself that I would ensure you were safe. Because in the years since, I have watched from a distance as you cared for your dying father with devotion that humbled me. Because when I learned what Theodore had done, I felt fury unlike anything I had experienced before. He paused. And because the thought of Marlowe laying hands on you, hurting you, destroying the spirit I have admired from afar for a decade, was unbearable. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Emmeline felt her heart hammer against her ribs. You have admired me from afar, she repeated softly. For 10 years. Yes, that is not mere obligation. That is something else. Julian's eyes met hers, and she saw the truth there before he spoke it. Yes, it is. Emmeline spent the night in the hunting lodge's single bedchamber while Julian and Edmund slept in the main room by the fire. She lay awake for hours, her mind replaying the day's impossible events. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Julian riding into the chapel, heard his voice declaring her free, felt his arms around her as they fled. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Julian alone in the clearing outside the lodge, tending to his horse. The early light caught the angles of his face, making him look both severe and beautiful. He turned at her approach, concern immediate in his expression. Did you sleep? He asked. Little, Emmeline admitted, but I have thought a great deal. Julian straightened, giving her his full attention. And, I have a question first, she said, gathering her courage. Yesterday you offered me 3 options. Flight, protected independence, or marriage to you, but you have not told me what you truly want. Julian's jaw tightened. What I want is irrelevant. This must be your choice. Humour me, Emmeline pressed. If I were not a factor, if you could arrange this situation however you pleased, what would you do? He was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes searching hers. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. I would marry you, not out of obligation or convenience, but because I have spent 10 years regretting that I let you walk away without telling you who I was. Because every report I received about you over those years made me admire you more. Because when I saw you in that garden yesterday crying alone, I wanted to give you every happiness I could provide. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. But, Julian continued firmly, I will not trap you. You have been controlled and sold like property. I will not add to that by pressuring you into a marriage you do not want. Emmeline stepped closer to him. What if I want it? His breath caught. Emmeline, you offer me honesty, she said. Then I shall be equally honest. I am terrified. Of Marlowe, of my uncle, of an uncertain future. But when you held me yesterday, when you told me I was safe, I believed you. Not because I am naive, but because I remembered that voice from 10 years ago. The voice that saved me once and promised I was safe then too. That does not mean you should marry me, Julian said, though his eyes had darkened with something like hope. Safety can be provided in other ways. Can it? Emmeline challenged. You said yourself that Marlowe will seek revenge, that Theodore retains legal authority over me, that society will assume the worst regardless of the truth. She took a breath. But as your wife, I would be beyond their reach. and I would have time. Time to heal from what Theodore and Marlowe tried to do to me. Time to discover what kind of life I might want. Time to see if you and I might become something more than a strategic alliance. Julian's hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the emotion she could see him fighting to contain. I would give you all the time you need. I would demand nothing. I would simply be grateful to know you were safe. Then ask me, Emmeline whispered. Emmeline Fairmont, will you marry me? Yes. The ceremony took place the following day in the small chapel of the village nearest the hunting lodge. Only Edmund and the elderly priest were present to witness their vows. Emmeline wore a simple dress of pale blue that Edmund had procured from the innkeeper's daughter. It fit poorly, too loose in the bodice and too short at the hem, but she infinitely preferred it to the elaborate gown Marlowe had provided. Julian stood beside her at the altar, his hand warm and steady around hers, as the priest intoned the familiar words. When it came time to speak their vows, Emmeline's voice wavered only slightly. I, Emmeline Fairmont, take you, Julian Davenport, to be my lawfully wedded husband. Julian's voice was firm and certain. I, Julian Davenport, take you, Emmeline Fairmont, to be my lawfully wedded wife. The priest blessed their union. Edmund produced a simple gold band that had belonged to Julian's mother. Julian slid it onto Emmeline's finger, his eyes never leaving hers. You may kiss your bride, the priest said. Julian hesitated, giving Emmeline the choice. She leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in the briefest of kisses. It was chaste, formal, the seal on a contract between strangers. But when she pulled back, something in Julian's expression made her breath catch. He looked at her as though she were precious, as though this hasty marriage in a country chapel meant everything to him. They signed the register. Edmund congratulated them with genuine warmth. And just like that, Emmeline became the Duchess of Northcliffe. The reality of it did not truly strike her until they departed the chapel, and Edmund announced he was returning to London to handle the legal aftermath of the wedding interruption. Marlowe will have begun legal proceedings by now, Edmund said. I will ensure our solicitors are prepared with documentation proving the debts belong to Julian, not Marlowe. The marriage invalidates any remaining claims. What of Theodore? Emmeline asked. I will handle him as well, Edmund assured her. Your uncle now owes Julian directly. He will not dare to cause further trouble. After Edmund departed, Emmeline and Julian were left alone for the first time as husband and wife. They returned to the hunting lodge, and awkwardness settled between them like a third presence. You should rest, Julian said, not quite meeting her eyes. The past days have been exhausting. As have yours, Emmeline pointed out. Yes, well. Julian moved toward the door. I will sleep in the stable tonight, to give you privacy. Julian. Emmeline's voice stopped him. You do not need to sleep in a stable. There is a bedchamber. I trust you to honor your word about separate sleeping arrangements. He turned to face her, vulnerability flickering across his features before being suppressed. I gave you my word that this marriage would demand nothing from you. I intend to keep it. I know, Emmeline said softly. That is precisely why I trust you. Something eased in Julian's expression. He nodded once, then retreated to the main room, leaving Emmeline alone in the bedchamber. She lay awake again that night, listening to Julian move about the outer room as he prepared to sleep. She was married now, a duchess, wife to a man who had saved her twice and asked nothing in return. And despite the strangeness of it all, despite the hasty vows and uncertain future, Emmeline felt something she had not experienced in months. Hope. 1 week after their wedding, Julian and Emmeline returned to London as the Duke and Duchess of Northcliffe. The journey was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them in the capital. Edmund had sent word that Marlowe's legal challenges had been systematically dismantled, but that society buzzed with speculation about the dramatic wedding interruption and subsequent hasty marriage. The Northcliffe townhouse in Mayfair was elegant and imposing, its white stone facade gleaming in afternoon sunlight. Servants lined up to greet their new mistress, their expressions carefully neutral despite the scandal that surely preceded her arrival. Emmeline met each introduction with grace, determined to prove herself worthy of the title she now bore. Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, showed Emmeline to the Duchess's chambers. They were magnificent, decorated in soft greens and golds, with windows overlooking the private garden. A connecting door led to the Duke's suite, but it remained firmly closed. "His Grace instructed us to prepare these rooms to your preferences," Mrs. Crawford said, her manner warming slightly. "If anything does not suit, you need only say the word." "They are perfect," Emmeline replied. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford." Over the following weeks, Emmeline threw herself into learning her new role. She met with the housekeeper daily to review household accounts and management. She called upon the wives of Julian's closest associates, presenting herself with quiet dignity that gradually won them over. She began attending charitable functions, discovering a passion for the plight of women left destitute by circumstance. Throughout it all, Julian maintained the respectful distance he had promised. They took breakfast together, discussing estate matters and social obligations with the ease of business partners. He attended functions at her side, presenting a united front to society. But he never pressed for more, never suggested that their marriage become anything beyond the strategic alliance they had agreed upon. Emmeline found herself both grateful for his consideration and increasingly frustrated by it. At night, lying alone in her magnificent bedchamber, she would hear Julian moving about in the adjoining rooms and wonder what it might be like if things were different between them. If he touched her the way a husband touched a wife, if he looked at her with desire rather than careful respect. But she had no right to want such things. He had married her out of duty and compassion, not love. She would not burden him with expectations beyond what they had agreed upon. 3 months after their return to London, Emmeline was reviewing correspondence in the morning room when Edmund was announced. He entered with a troubled expression that immediately put her on alert. "Your Grace," he greeted her formally, then glanced around. "Is Julian here?" "He is at his club," Emmeline replied. "What is wrong, Edmund?" Edmund hesitated, then withdrew a folded newspaper from his coat. "I thought you should see this before it spreads further. Marlowe has been arrested." Emmeline took the paper, scanning the article. Lord Victor Marlowe had been taken into custody following new evidence regarding his first wife's death. A former servant, emboldened by Marlowe's recent public disgrace, had come forward with testimony about the night Lady Helena died. The investigation had been reopened, and charges of murder were now being considered. "He will likely hang if convicted," Edmund said quietly. Emmeline felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that Marlowe would face justice, guilt that she felt such relief, and beneath it all, profound gratitude that Julian had prevented her from becoming Marlowe's second victim. "Does Julian know?" she asked. "I came here first. I wanted to ensure you heard it from someone who cares about your well-being rather than through gossip." "Thank you, Edmund." Emmeline set down the paper with hands that shook slightly. "I should have been his wife. If Julian had not intervened, I would have been Lady Marlowe when this evidence came to light. Society would have assumed I knew, that I was complicit. But you are not Lady Marlowe," Edmund reminded her gently. "You are the Duchess of Northcliffe, and no breath of scandal can touch you now." That evening, when Julian returned home, Emmeline was waiting in the library. He entered to find her standing by the window, the newspaper clutched in her hand. "You have heard," he said, closing the door behind him. "Yes." Emmeline turned to face him. "Edmund brought me the news this morning." Julian moved toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "How are you?" "Grateful," Emmeline replied honestly, horrified by what might have been, and feeling something I cannot quite name. "What is that?" "That I owe you my life twice over, once from drowning and once from a fate far worse than death." Julian's expression softened. "You owe me nothing, Emmeline." "I owe you everything," she countered, "and yet I have no way to repay such a debt. You have given me safety, position, respect. You ask for nothing in return. You barely even look at me except when duty requires it." Julian stiffened. "I am honouring the agreement we made. I promised you autonomy, space to heal. I will not break that promise." "What if I want you to break it?" The words came out before Emmeline could stop them. Silence descended. Julian stared at her, something desperate flickering in his eyes before he suppressed it. "You do not know what you are saying," he said roughly. "You have been through trauma. You are grateful, and gratitude can be mistaken for other feelings." "Do not tell me what I feel," Emmeline said, crossing the space between them. "I am 26 years old, not a child. I know my own mind, and I know that for 3 months I have lain awake at night, listening to you in the next room, wishing you would knock on that connecting door." Julian's breath caught. "Emmeline, you said you admired me from afar for 10 years, she continued, emboldened by his reaction. "You said the thought of Marlowe touching me was unbearable. Do you still feel that way? Or have I disappointed you somehow? Failed to live up to the woman you imagined?" "Failed." Julian laughed, the sound almost pained. "Emmeline, you exceed every expectation I ever had. You have taken a scandal and turned it into triumph. You move through society with grace that makes me proud every time I see it. And yes, I lie awake at night, tormented by your presence mere feet away, knowing I have no right to cross that threshold." "Why not?" Emmeline demanded. "We are married. We are husband and wife-in-law. Why should we not be so in truth?" "Because you deserve more than a marriage born of desperation," Julian said fiercely. "You deserve courtship, romance, choice, not a man who bound you to him when you had no other options." Emmeline reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He froze at the contact, his eyes darkening. "You gave me choice," she said softly. "You offered me 3 options and let me decide. I chose you, Julian. Not because I had no other choice, but because even then, frightened and traumatized as I was, I recognized something in you that I wanted, that I want still." "What is that?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Safety, yes, but also kindness, integrity, and something else. Something I am only now beginning to understand." She moved closer until their bodies almost touched. "You have waited for me to heal. You have given me time and space. But I think I have healed enough, and I am tired of sleeping alone." Julian's control shattered. His arms came around her, pulling her against him with a gentleness that belied the intensity in his eyes. "Are you certain? Because once I claim you as my wife in truth, I will never let you go." "I have been yours since you pulled me from that lake," Emmeline whispered. "I was simply too young to know it then." He kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding. This was heat and promise, and 10 years of restrained longing, finally given permission to exist. Emmeline melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with equal fervour. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since I was 22 years old, and you thanked me for saving your life even as you struggled to breathe. I have loved you through every year since, and I will love you for every year that remains to us." Tears slipped down Emmeline's cheeks. "I love you too. I think I have been falling in love with you since the moment you rode into that chapel and declared me free." Julian swept her into his arms, carrying her toward the connecting door between their chambers. "Then let me show you what freedom truly means." 18 months later, Emmeline sat in the crowded gallery of the House of Commons, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Below, the air throbbed with restless mutters and the scrape of boots on stone as members took their seats. On the table before the Speaker lay a proposal she herself had drafted, a bill seeking reform of the laws that allowed guardians to barter their wards' futures like chattel. It called for stricter oversight of marriage contracts, clearer grounds for annulment in cases of coercion, and harsher penalties for men who profited from such arrangements. The member sponsoring the bill, a seasoned MP and long-standing ally of Julian's, rose to address the chamber. His voice carried through the hall as he spoke the arguments Emmeline had laboured over by candlelight, drawing on testimony from ruined wives, desperate daughters, and neglected widows who had trusted her with their stories. Julian sat a few rows away in the Peers' gallery, his gaze never straying far from his wife. He had argued with ministers, cajoled reluctant supporters, and traded on his influence as Northcliffe to bring the proposal this far. But it was Emmeline's quiet determination that had given the bill its heart. When the time came to vote, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Emmeline's fingers tightened around the edge of the rail as members filed through the division lobbies. Minutes stretched into small eternities. At last, the clerk read out the numbers. The bill passed by a narrow margin. Sound crashed over her. Cheers from the supporters. Grumbles from the opponents. The sharp rap of the speaker's gavel, calling for order. Emmeline let out a shuddering breath she had not realized she was holding, as the meaning of the words settled over her. It was only a first step, and the law would not mend every injustice overnight. But the door had been forced open. Women like her would have more protection than she had ever been afforded. Julian was waiting for her when she left the gallery. He took her gloved hand and pressed it to his lips, his eyes bright with pride. "Well done, Duchess," he murmured. "We make a good team," Emmeline replied, her heart still pounding as she met his gaze. "The best," Julian agreed softly. "Now and always." They stepped out of Parliament together, walking into sunlight that felt like a blessing, side by side, not as strangers bound by convenience, but as partners who had chosen one another freely. Their marriage no longer a bargain struck in desperation, but a union forged in the crucible of adversity and strengthened by mutual respect and devotion. Sometimes the price of freedom was paid not in gold, but in courage, trust, and the willingness to believe that even the darkest circumstances could lead to unexpected joy.